Well, welcome. Tonight, we're going to hear about a part of our government that actually seems to be working. That's Beacon Hill. After hearing so much about Capitol Hill down in D.C. being so dysfunctional, it's kind of pleasant to see both red and blue working together for the betterment of Milford. But in case there is somebody who doesn't know you, let's start with an introduction.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Al. I'm Ryan Fattman. I'm the state senator for the town of Milford and 13 other wonderful communities. I'm serving in my second term, and for me, it's a great honor. I always say, I grew up with this last name, Fattman. You can imagine I've been called a lot of things in the course of my life. The best things I've ever been called are titles like husband, father, son, uncle, brother. And for me to be called state senator is a great honor. Not as important as those previous
But have you
things I
heard the
just
word
listed
daddy
off.
yet?
Oh yeah, yeah.
There was the title that meant the most.
Absolutely. But the wonderful thing about all those titles is they're all that we share. We have them in common. You have some that I don't, grandfather. Hopefully I'll be blessed enough one day that I'll have that situation in my life, but I like to concentrate on that commonality because that's what builds community and that's how we govern ourselves. So
Now, you've been involved in a lot of bills I want to talk about.
sure.
So you've been busy little beaver, which is good.
Yeah.
But the one that seems to grab the headlines is the one that probably has me the most confused. The unsafe cities, or what are we calling it now? Sanctuary,
Yeah.
unsafe practice?
There's sort of, it's a complicated issue. You can kind of bifurcate it into two. So first, the legislation is the Safe Communities legislation that's been filed by people, State Senator Jamie Eldridge, and basically what they seek to do is make Massachusetts a sanctuary state. It used to be the conversation was about sanctuary cities and cities and municipalities declaring themselves open to people who come to the country unlawfully, being able to provide sanctuary. Now the concept has gone statewide. There's a state rep.
Ryan, I'm confused. I really am.
Yeah. And by the way, I do not accept this premise. Just I want to make sure that
just sanctuary state, city, country, whatever, sanctuary something.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like a really nice thing that people who are abused, who are hurt, who need help.
Yeah.
In theory, it sounds like a good idea that we should help people. But then I hear, no, it's really to protect guests we've either let in or not let in and come in who've committed crimes.
Yeah.
So why do I want to protect criminals?
Well, I think going back, so you got these two issues, right? So this is one issue that a lot of people have been talking about. This is proposed legislation, and I think we can get into why it was proposed and why I disagree with it. The second issue you have is the Supreme Judicial Court decided what was known as the Lund case, and they came out and said that the ICE detainer program in Massachusetts is not legal. So essentially, people in law enforcement would arrest somebody for some crime that they had committed in the process, whether it be breaking and entering or assault and battery. It could be a routine traffic violation, maybe, a little bit more than routine. They were driving 110 miles an hour down the road. Then they check against a database that the ICE
crime that it's enough that it requires fingerprinting.
Correct. And so they look into the situation, they cross-reference the person who has been apprehended, and they look at a federal database that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement maintains, ICE, and if there's a detainer on that person for some outstanding issue, they had the right to maintain them in custody for 48 hours. The SJC came in and said that is illegal. There's no statute in Massachusetts, there's no law on the books that permit the local authorities to work with federal officials. And there was question about the 10th Amendment and states' rights as part of that justification. So those are the two big immigration issues right now that are...
I am old and slow.
Yeah.
Al Correa, U.S. born, U.S. citizen. Mm-hmm. I go and I break and enter, murder, rape, pillage, do something in Massachusetts. And I scurry off to Rhode Island. And I get arrested in Rhode Island. Massachusetts doesn't have the right to ask for extradition that I get pulled back to Massachusetts
Right.
to stand trial in front of my peers?
Right. Well, I think at the end of the day, this is all about keeping Massachusetts residents safe. And beyond Massachusetts residents, it should be about keeping U.S. citizens
Right.
safe and legal residents.
But again, if I commit a crime in one state of the United States, and and I run away to another one,
yeah,
as a citizen resident, Massachusetts can say, "Hey, North Carolina,
yeah,
Ryan is a bad man. Send him back here so he can have due process."
exactly.
But then, if I'm an illegal alien, I can't do that?
According to the SJC, there was no law on the books that permitted it. So we've got our two issues, right? No ICE detainers anymore, even though it was a program that was supported by the Obama administration, the Trump administration now. It would have been maintained by the Clinton administration had she won. Deval Patrick did have a program like this, and the governor, Governor Baker, has maintained this program up until last week when it got struck down. I believe it was on Thursday.
But essentially, I'm getting the gist. If
Yep.
I'm an American citizen, totally legal, and I do an illegal thing, I can be extradited,
Right. Yep.
which means you could hold me until the police from the state I committed a crime in would extradite me.
Right.
But if I'm an illegal alien who created or committed an illegal act,
Yep.
the court said, you can't hold me?
Yeah, essentially. And they said they can't hold you because there's no statute. So the governor came out on Monday, I believe, Monday or Tuesday, and filed a bill that would create the statute that would permit local law enforcement, whether it be state police, municipal police, or other law enforcement agencies, environmental police, on the state and local level, that they would have the ability to maintain this detainer program. It is different than in the past, and there's some things that I don't like about it. There's some things I do like about it. For example, the governor says, in his legislation, that it's not mandatory, just like before. Same program. The municipality can opt in and participate in it. That has been the practice for the last 7 or 8 years.
And again, I'm confused. There's a federal law that says the IRS can collect taxes.
Right.
If I can ignore one federal law, why can't I tell the IRS, I don't like that law, I don't want to pay you?
Yeah,
I mean, we have policemen, and we have fantastic cops in Milford.
Yep.
I mean, I've taken a lot of pride when I explain to people that there's been 2 demonstrations concerning our police by residents.
Yeah.
One was on a day like today with miserable weather, people standing out in front of the police station holding signs that said, "Thank you, we respect you."
Yeah.
And 2 were the signs that said, "We respect Milford Police." Okay, so we got good cops who want to do the right thing,
Yeah.
and we're telling them they don't have to follow the law if they don't like it?
Yeah, it's a bit ridiculous. So at least what the governor's legislation does is it allows for the program to exist as it has in the past. Past practice has been, you can make a detention and hold that person. Now, the difference is, he says in his legislation that detention can only be for 12 hours. After 12 hours expires, you need to have judicial review and go before a judge and
Can you
request.
do a search? If you do this on a Saturday,
Yep.
how the heck do you get it done in 12 hours?
Well, it would be up, according to the governor's bill, it would be up to ICE, the federal government enforcement agency, to come in and collect that individual.
Within 12 hours?
Within 12 hours. Now, I disagree with that. I think it should be at least 24 hours. I think 48 hours makes a lot more sense. If we're doing this, if we think it's a good idea, and we say, before the Supreme Judicial Court's decision, which struck down it as illegal, that it was going well and it was working, then why not go back and revert to the program that was working? So instead of the 12, at some point, I'm sure the Senate is going to take this up for debate. I will offer an amendment that says, let's put it back to 48 hours. Another thing that is different about this legislation that the governor filed is he mandates that there has to be a supervisor role attributed to a police officer in the detention program. So he says, in the past, there's been no sort of delegation of this responsibility. If a police officer pulled somebody over, they arrested somebody for committing a crime, that police officer could carry out the duties, looking up the person in the federal database, checking, referencing it with ICE, and then they could act as the agent and have the detention of the person committing the crime. In this situation with the governor's legislation, he would actually delegate that responsibility through the agency, through the local police department. So the chief of police, the lieutenant, would choose a certain amount of officers, 2 or 3, to be able to carry out the program. I think that's the wrong approach. I think what that does is actually ties the hands of local law enforcement. I think that local law enforcement are already stretched. They do a tremendous amount of things in the community. Just delegating 1 or 2 or 3 people to have this responsibility when it is a law enforcement function, to me, just doesn't make sense.
Now again, humor an old man. I trust an officer to carry a gun
Yeah,
and defend my daughter, your daughter,
right.
in any way he has been trained and sees fit.
Yep.
But then I say, well, but I don't trust you enough to do the research after you've arrested somebody?
Yeah. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't make sense.
Wait a minute, the guy's got a gun.
Yeah. Right.
He's out there with a gun.
Right.
If I trust him with a gun and the lives of my family, you know, because let's face it, these guys go out and they put their life in front of
Every day.
Stephanie and babykins and
Yep.
my, you know, darling bride and my daughters every day.
Yeah.
And then I say, well, yeah, but I don't really trust you to do paperwork.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't make much sense, and I think it's arbitrary, burdensome. I think for local police, especially, you know, we before
You ought to
this,
fire the cops. If I can't trust you
Yeah.
to do paperwork, then I don't want you carrying a gun in my town.
We have
How silly is that?
we have a great group of summer interns working in my office this summer, and Peter Elia is one of them. He's actually from the town of Milford. And
Yes.
We've got a woman on the town council in Southbridge, and this is a project they've been working on. So I had them reach out to all the police departments, 14 in my district, and ask the question, you know, do you respect and honor ICE detainers? And universally, it came back, yes, we either have or we would. There were some communities, Millville, for example, that would never have had that situation occur. It's a small town, 3,000 people. But the police chief said, you better believe we would do it if we were asked to. And so the 14 towns that I represent, they all honor the detainer. But what's unique is if Millville ever did have a situation like this, well, Millville only has, I believe, 7 full-time police officers or 6 full-time police officers. At any one given time in the evening, 2 are on duty. One in dispatch, you know, one in the station, one is in a cruiser. So you're going to require an additional arbitrary
You're gonna pull
burden.
a cop who's been working shifts, who's home resting,
Yeah,
back in.
right.
I mean, it just seems insane to me because the police officers of Milford, I trust with my family.
Yep,
How can I say I don't trust them to do paperwork?
right.
And, you know, and I joke saying you ought to fire him. Well, hey, Tom O'Laughlin, you ought to never hire somebody that you don't trust to fill in some paperwork
Sure.
and hand them a gun.
Yep,
It just seems, wait a minute, we ought to be respecting, this is disrespect to somebody.
Yeah.
Saying, oh, it's okay for you to go put your life on the line,
yeah.
you know, and protect my family, but paperwork?
Yeah, no, it doesn't make much sense. And once again, you know, it goes back to the governor filed this. There was nothing. You know, the Supreme Judicial Court struck this down, so we have nothing on the books right now.
Don't get me wrong, I'm being
So-
a twit
No,
on this, but
and that's my point.
I'm glad
I wanna,
Charlie put something in.
Exactly. I want to make sure that people understand, listening to me, I do have some issues with the bill, but if the bill was up for a vote tomorrow, is it perfect? No. But would I vote for it? Absolutely, because it's about public safety. I mean, can you imagine a scenario where, and this is a bit extreme, but if you follow it, it makes sense. You know, Osama bin Laden gets pulled over, and you find out that he was speeding. Oh, and by the way, he's Osama bin Laden. Well, if there was a nice detainer on him, he could not be held based on the ruling that
Well,
the Supreme Judicial
well,
Court.
Ryan, the thing
Now,
is-
I would think common sense would play out, and someone would say, "Screw what the Supreme Judicial
Right.
Court said. I'm taking
You're
this
a
guy
bad
into
man,
custody."
you're going to kill Americans.
Exactly. But things being as bureaucratic as they become in the legal system, that would
I can't imagine how I could look at somebody and say with a straight face, I arrested, you know, Joe, Sally, whoever,
yeah.
and they're murderers.
Yep.
and it's a woman. Are you an American citizen? Because if you are, I'm putting you in jail.
Right.
But if you're an illegal immigrant, I got to let you go.
Right. Yeah.
Well, isn't this our country?
Well, you kind of wonder. But and so, you know, I like the bill that he filed.
It's a good start.
I think it's a great start. There has to be more conversation. I believe in the fall. We're right now, you know, today is August 3rd, right? 2nd. And, you know, we're on the break until Labor Day, so we won't be voting on anything. There won't be any committee hearings. Of course, we, you know, still working.
At least you've got something. Hats off to Charlie Baker for putting something on the table that you can now discuss.
Exactly.
Because you're starting de novo. You're starting with a blank sheet of paper saying,
Yep.
okay, the Supreme Court emptied the bin.
Right.
So let's start putting some legislation in the bin that we can talk about.
Exactly. And one last thing that I would add to this conversation that really has been vacant is, and this undermines, this goes after the Safe Communities Act, the legislation that would make Massachusetts a sanctuary. So the justification, the rationale behind that thought, and I think to some extent it's valid, right? People who file that bill say, well, the problem is that victims of crimes will not come forward to police officers when they're here illegally for fear of deportation. That's the argument. That's why they say you need a safe community, quote unquote, because that way someone who is a victim of a crime who is here illegally, they will come forward because they won't feel that they're going to be deported, and therefore they will go get the guys who were maybe illegal and committed the crime, and then the police will work to go get them. So that's the justification. I don't agree with that justification. I'll tell you why. This is something has not been part of the conversation, and it has to be, and it's very important. In the year 2000, the U.S. Congress passed a law that created several visas. The reason why they passed them were based on situations where illegal immigrants had come forward, and there was no protections for them as victims. They were raped, they were beaten, and they came forward, and yes, they did the right thing, and they got the guys, but then they got deported. Yeah. And I can't think of a worse situation. And you know, the humanitarian, exactly, the humanitarian in me says that's a situation that's a bit unique. So Congress, in bipartisan support in 2000, they passed a law that said we're going to have U visas and T visas for people who are human trafficked, and we discovered that they're here illegally, but they've been human trafficked. We're going to give them a T visa, which protects them from deportation, so long as this person works with us to go get these human traffickers and make sure that they go to federal prison. The second one was the U visa, and that's the same exact thing. If you're the victim of rape, of attempted murder, of some violent, vicious crime, you know, and you come forward as somebody who is an illegal alien, then you are protected. So therefore, the whole premise of the safe communities is non-existent, because we already have laws in place, federal laws in place that protect people who come forward. The governor's bill doesn't address that. I will file the amendment to require all these applications to be available in police stations.
Remember, Tom O'Laughlin came and he said, look, I know 28,000 of us believe Milford's the center of the universe.
Yeah.
6 billion need to be educated, but at least when you look at it, he goes, my role is to enforce local laws.
Yep.
I do not have the ability to enforce immigration laws.
Right.
So if I find out that, you know, Sally or Joe is here illegally, what can I do? Arrest them and deport them to Rhode Island?
Right.
He says, I have nothing to do with immigration.
Right.
He says, in a way, that's a very strong tool for him.
Yep.
Because people who are here illegally can step forward and say, wait a minute, the next level that I can deal with is people who are committing crimes.
Yep.
Whether they're U.S. citizens or not.
Right.
If they commit a crime in Milford, they're mine.
Right. Exactly.
And I guess when I hear this whole sanctuary
and that's
thing,
a good standard.
Well,
you know, because that's them doing their job. And that's where this debate can devolve, because there's a lot of people on the left that say, oh, well, we don't want our local police to become immigration enforcement officials. They are not.
They can't by law.
They can't by law, first of all. And secondly, even when they're enforcing the law, they're not saying, oh, are you here legally or are you here illegally? They're enforcing the law. You know, that's the standard.
But the Supreme Court almost said that. Are you here as a legal U.S. citizen? Yes. Then we can arrest you so you can be extradited.
Right.
Oh, you're here illegally? We'll have to let you go.
Right.
I mean, it baffles my mind because you've got somebody like Tom and his staff who really understand
Yeah.
that they don't want to be playing in this base layer that, one, they have no right to, and two, will undermine their ability to clean out the bad people.
Yeah, the Supreme Judicial Court, it's very akin to a ruling that they made a few years ago, and it passed a law like lightning because of what happened. So the Supreme Judicial Court came out and said that there was no law that prohibited somebody, it was called the upskirting law, from taking a
pictures?
picture with someone's camera up a woman's skirt on the Boston T, right? And so that was their ruling. And all of a sudden, within less than an hour, the legislature came in, filed legislation, and made it illegal for somebody to take, terrible pictures
My
of people.
mother, my darling bride, my
Yeah.
daughter. You sit there and say, guys,
Yeah,
women, stand up.
right.
I can't see anybody
Yeah,
saying, well, we should have a consideration that it's okay.
right. And that's the thing. They basically interpreted the law and said there is no law, and we're not going to make the law, which I can respect because
Well,
pretty
they're
much
not supposed to make laws. You are.
Exactly. That's my responsibility. That's 199 other people that I serve with in the state legislature. And, so I can appreciate the fact that they said that there is no law, so therefore we can't charge a person with this. But then the legislature came in, I voted on it,
That was
we
the
made the
quickest
law.
bill I've ever seen go through.
It was. And that's actually a similar situation of what happened with this ICE detainer program is they said there's no law that permits it to be legal. And so now the legislature is responsible for creating the law and doing the right thing. I just think that there should be some protections in there for victims. I think that's an important part of the conversation. And the humanitarian in all of us, the mom, the dad, the uncle, the brother, the grandfather, the husband, the wife, the roles that we all play, none of us want to see somebody victimized. None of us want to see somebody hurt. And I can empathize with even somebody, there was just news the other day that a bunch of people came over from Mexico. They were in some truck and they died.
Yes.
Because
They're
they
in the
were
3
essentially
foot-
fried.
3 foot crawl space left to fry.
Exactly. And so that's part of the problem. Because when you don't have laws that say, you can't do this, people try to skirt around them. And in the process, they get taken advantage of by people who are probably, who knows, trafficking drugs or whatever. But they got taken advantage of and now they're dead for a false promise
And now
because
if
we
I
don't enforce
arrest
our laws.
the guy who put these poor people into a fryer later,
Yeah.
and I find out he's here illegally, I can't hold him?
Right. Yeah, I know. That question might be above my pay grade. I mean, that person, that's just...
Some of the things we're joking about, but at the end of the day, you sit there and say, the golden rule. There's common sense.
Yeah.
Sticking a camera to take a picture of somebody's bum makes no sense.
Right.
Right? I'm sorry. There's just it's like child pornography.
Right.
Any sense of liberalism that I have towards people goes away if you hurt a kid.
Right.
Any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Any kind of abuse, physical, so wait a minute. How could anybody say that's okay?
Right. And it's absolutely not. And so, with this law, sometimes it gets portrayed as controversial, the ICE detainer program. To me, it's just common sense. And
Ryan,
it is...
If you went, and I mean, luckily, my grandfather in '39 came to Milford, and people helped him out. Mm-hmm. He showed up with his $32.80 life savings in his pocket.
Yeah.
Worked his backside off to send money home.
Right.
But there are people who came not totally legal.
Yeah.
And they put their heads down and they work like animals to better their family. Can I hold it really against them?
Right.
No, I can't. Because they're just doing in a different way what my grandfather did for me.
Yeah.
So if Tom and the police were going after them, maybe I'd have a different feeling.
Right.
But it's like, if I invite you in my home and you start breaking furniture, God dang it, I should have the right to throw you out.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be something that says, just don't commit a crime And chances are, we're going to wink, and because we all know we need a certain level of, immigrants.
Yeah. And absolutely, part of this too, when you consider Massachusetts' history and role, is that we've had 2 terrorist attacks launched from here, and in the bill that Baker filed, it does say, wanted on the terrorism list. There's a perfectly good reason to be able to detain somebody. If the FBI wants you because of suspected
Holy moly,
terrorism.
you're telling me the guy who bombed the Boston Marathon could have been arrested, and they could have said, well, you can't hold him because he's not here legally?
Yeah, and there's that, and I've actually, somebody emailed me who I respect, and out of respect for her, I won't divulge the name, but she's an expert on immigration policy, a lawyer, and worked for the State Department. And she said, I believe that, this current law that Baker filed, that if it's not expanded, that Nicholas Guaman actually may have had to have been released at the time. That is a bit crazy. I have to look into that a little bit, but that's not acceptable.
It's above my pay grade.
Yeah.
But then again, you got involved in another bill.
Yeah.
And again, common sense.
Right.
When Stephanie was pregnant.
I'm glad that's over.
When my darling bride
Don't
was
let her
pregnant.
watch this.
I was going to say, you're in deep trouble. There's common sense that all of us, would like accommodations to be made.
Yeah.
Tell me about your bill, because it seems silly to me that what you were proposing was like, I think the technical phrase is duh.
Right, yeah. So, the bill was filed in the Senate by a wonderful person, Joan Lovely. Lovely is her last name, which is kind of funny. And who am I to speak? I've got Fattman. But, she's a very pleasant person and worked with me. It was her bill. But I noticed a deficiency in the bill that I explained.
But take us a step back. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
What was the bill?
So the bill is the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act is what the technical name
And
was.
what was its intent?
And so basically the intention of it was, if a woman is pregnant, that employers should give reasonable accommodations for her pregnancy. So for example, the reason why this bill was filed, the reason why Joan Lovely filed the bill 2 sessions ago, was that there was a woman who worked in manufacturing, and she had a lot of physical labor that she had to do. When she actually became pregnant, and this was identified by her employers, they didn't lessen her workload or her hours. They actually increased some of the weight on which she had to lift. And it's a real tragedy, because after doing this, they had her working a later shift, so they moved her to the third shift in the middle of the night.
How would you feel if you caused harm to her or the baby? Because, okay, for a few months you couldn't tell her she doesn't have to lift to 50 pounds.
Right. Well, the unfortunate part is, it seems, just based on those 2 examples, that she was almost targeted. And but what happened was she lost her baby.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so it's pretty sad stuff. And
I said that as a hypothetical, but...
Yeah, and she did. She lost her baby. They basically put her through so much work, and she was in a position economically where not working wasn't an option. She had to work, even if she was pregnant. And so, unfortunately, she lost her child. And, the bill was filed by Joan Lovely because of that. And last session, it got through the Senate, but it didn't really go anywhere. There was some concerns by the business community, because there were certain mandates that were in the original bill that didn't make it into the second bill, and it included some mandatory compensation. But the business
compensation for
time off. And so there was a bit different in the second filing of the bill. The second filing of the bill took that part out and basically said, listen, make reasonable accommodations. If a woman is pregnant,
have a heart,
and she does, part of her job is lifting things,
70 pounds.
Yeah,
come on,
change her role. Don't make her. Do that.
I could see change her role for that period.
Temporarily.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's not you're going to change your role when she comes back after pregnancy and...
Correct.
But...
Yep. Or if you work on shifts, don't move a pregnant woman's shift to the third, overnight shift.
That just seems mean.
Yeah.
If I'm a first shift worker...
Right.
And I've got all the accommodations, because I may have other kids at home...
Right.
You move me to third shift, and my whole life's upside down.
Right. And, there's a reasonable time period. Pregnancy's 9 months, hopefully. And
It's not like you can draw it out.
Right.
It's not like you can say, I'm going to milk it and
Yeah.
keep my pregnancy for 11 or 12 months.
Exactly.
There is kind of within a few weeks, and if you remember the last few weeks, I don't know anybody that wanted to extend the pregnancy.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. So the bill, I thought, had one deficiency, and it's based off an experience that my wife and I had. So February 9th, I believe, was the date we were going to find out whether we were having a boy or a girl. I wanted a boy, my wife wanted a girl, and the compromise...
Bet you changed your mind now.
Well, the compromise was we wanted a healthy baby.
Yeah.
And so we got the ultrasound, we found out we were having a girl, it was wonderful. We got shifted over to our doctor's room, waiting for her to come in, and she came in and was more serious than I'd ever seen her. And she said, "Congratulations, but there's a problem." And the problem was that she had...
Those words.
Yeah, and it was
I remember
chilling.
when we did the amnio,
Yep.
it's when you look up and you say, please.
Yeah.
You know, just please.
Yeah,
Just healthy.
It was. I mean, your heart drops when you hear that. And so, to make a long story short, Hadley had a cyst on her brain. Sometimes this happens. Sometimes it means nothing. Sometimes it's severe. It can lead to Edwards syndrome, which is a death sentence. It's basically severe mental retardation, or it could be Down syndrome, or other developmental disabilities.
Hadley, such a cutie.
Yeah, and God bless, people have met her. I take her to events, and she's perfectly healthy.
Yeah, you stopped with the title senator. You become father of Hadley. All of a sudden.
Absolutely. And dad, or da, as if she says. But, in the bill, the concentration was on the pregnant woman, which is fantastic, but there was no consideration for the child. And I didn't necessarily want to get into like a pro-life, pro-choice debate about this. What I wanted to do.
This is not pro-life. This is a discussion of pro-kid.
Right. And it's also about the mother, because think about my wife, right? From that moment that we learned what was going on, that set off a series of events, from going to Brigham and Women's and getting some,
But even the
second
emotional
opinions.
load on any parent. I remember the strongest prayers I ever said was please, and then the second time is please again.
Right.
And when you heard healthy, I had a reaction because the salad tongs put a little bruise.
Yeah.
And they said, I'll be gone in 3 days. I said, you broke my baby. But you think about the emotional load on you, but especially on Stephanie.
Yeah.
If there's even a question
Right.
of the health status of the baby, and then you're going to not, yes, like you said, you got to go to Brigham's, you got to go other places.
And so technically the bill that had been filed didn't address that type of situation. So, problem with the woman's health, she can be reasonably accommodated and take time off from work. However, problem with the baby's health, cyst on the brain, potentially having Down syndrome, going to Brigham and Women's for a second opinion, the bill didn't cover that situation. Perhaps another scenario that I spoke to Joan Lovely about, the state senator who wrote this bill, was what happens if the umbilical cord is wrapped around, going into the third trimester? The law doesn't really clarify whether, you would think with common sense that you'd say, okay, let's, let her.
And don't get into the whole abortion, pro-life, whatever.
Right. But common sense would dictate.
Here's a healthy baby that wants to come to this world.
Right.
And you're not going to make an accommodation?
Right. And so I filed an amendment that would basically allow for the health of the unborn child to be considered. And it passed, and it got unanimous support. It goes back to, I don't like the word compromise as much as I like the word consensus, right? So the consensus was this was a valid situation. What my wife went through, what I went through was not addressed by the bill. That should be addressed by the bill. And we put it in as an amendment, and we got to yes. And it was supported by 100% of the membership.
That everything worked out for Sweet Hadley.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank God.
Yep.
But you can't count on that every time.
Correct.
My daughter's involved with the special needs kids.
Yep.
And they're just, the families, the kids, they're just incredible.
Yeah.
And when you say you can't make a little bit of a special accommodation for a mother, you know, some of these single mothers, I don't know how they, well, you're learning.
Yeah.
2 against 1, you're barely keeping up.
Right, I know.
You know, and you sit there and say, if it's 1 against 1,
Yeah.
and then you put special needs on it, it's just amazing. What kind of human being doesn't want to help?
Yeah, and my heart goes out to any single parent out there, and just God bless them. They do God's work. But, you know, for this particular amendment, I was very proud. You know, we got it through. I think it's what government should be. You know, people of different opinions, different parties, different ideologies coming together and saying, hey, you know, I didn't catch that. That's a really great issue. I shared the entire story on the state Senate floor. I talked right through what happened to me and my wife, and this is why, to me, this is so important. And, you know, last Thursday, the governor signed this bill into law with my amendment as part of it. And, you know, I feel like we made a difference, you know, and that's why we do these positions.
It's one of those laws that you hope you never, ever experience or have to take advantage of.
Yeah.
Just like special needs programs, just like fire department.
Yep.
You know, we talked about the police department. I hope I never use Tom's staff.
Right.
Yeah. Or TUI Rev 2's fire staff.
Yeah.
Don't want to use them. But boy, am I glad they're there.
Absolutely. I remember when we had our fire inspection for our fire detectors, and guy's name was Robbie, and he was leaving. I was like, I hope I never see you again. You know, at least not here. But, you know, it was, I think, a reasonable amendment. Fortunately, it passed, and it became law.
But, you know, it almost feels like when we had the votes for the senior center and we laughed and said, who's going to vote against their mother?
Right.
You know, you sit there and say, okay, everybody in Beacon Hill probably has a son or a daughter if they don't have a young wife. You know, the youngsters still are working on their daughters and sons.
Oh, yeah.
The oldsters would be working on their grandsons.
Yep.
How can you vote against that when you know that this could affect your family?
Yeah, absolutely. And no one did. So that's the good news.
It's even better. It's good to hear.
Yeah.
You know,
especially with the dysfunction that's been going on in our country, which is not funny, but
I was very pleased when I heard Brian Murray come on. You know, Brian's very blue.
Yep.
You're not so blue.
Nope.
But when I hear the two of you, and let's shift over to the budget, you're working together to get good things for Milford.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah. We're now 8 months in to Brian's first term, and you know, he's been great to work with. I've enjoyed him. You know, I find him to be a really caring guy, and we've had the ability to host multiple events up in the State House together for the community. We've had the ability to work on funding issues for Milford, Mendon, Hopedale. I don't represent the part of Medway that he does, so I haven't been as involved with that.
Yeah, I asked him if we can trade a street, because somehow Medway traded us 2 streets or 1 precinct, and they've got Roy and Brian.
Right.
I said, can't we trade them like 1 little street off the side of Milford so we get 2 reps?
You have to wait a few years, but I will say, you know, I've enjoyed working with them. Actually, I think it was 2 weeks ago we had the Milford girls softball team up to celebrate their state championship. You know, their coach was with them. We gave them a tour of the State House, and it was just fantastic. We bought them lunch.
And Ryan, I love the PR aspect, but when you two work together, you've been working to get us real money.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, love the PR.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, I respect more when you bring us money.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that too. But I guess my point of that is the small things do matter.
Oh, absolutely.
And, you know, if you can't even do that, John Fernandez and I were always able to do that. And now Brian and I do that. And it's because you care about the girls, you know, you care about their victory, you care about Milford as a community, and you want to lift it up and celebrate that. There's a lot of things that don't get celebrated that should, and there's a lot of things that get elevated in the conversation that people, I think, just wish would go away. With regards to working on really substantive stuff, you know, we've worked together on ELL issues, but most recently we were able to restore money that had been cut for this opioid program that Amy Leone runs. And, you know, the JAG program, we got $80,000 for the budget in that. It did not get vetoed by the governor. Years previous, it had been.
It had.
And I made sure, you know, coming from the same party, as the governor, that he understood and his staff understood the importance of this, because we've had people die. You know, this is a really incredibly important issue to people who live in Hopedale and Milford. I think the last time I looked, we're nearing 12 deaths of opioid overdose.
When we grew up,
or heroin overdose.
way before your time, when I was young like you, the stereotype of the heroin addict, sleazy person in a back alley of Boston,
Yeah.
you know, dark alley, all bad.
Right.
Now you turn around and say, for the love of God, it's my neighbor's kids.
Right.
It's high school kids that got hooked on Oxy because they were playing football, basketball, whatever.
Yeah.
And now they can't afford to buy the stuff on the street.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it's no longer them.
Right.
This whole, I mean, everything Amy taught me was them is us.
Right. And I think that is very true. I still think there's a sleazy component to it, and I will say that those people are the distributors of this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the people who are trafficking these drugs, the people like fentanyl, heroin, you know, opioids that they get their hands on and are able to deal to kids or dealers. I mean, those people are sleazy.
When we grew up, you
and
heard
they deserve to go to
the
jail.
sleazers were putting rat poison, warfarin, everything in. I mean, the fentanyl might as well be rat poison.
Right. And we see marijuana being laced with fentanyl these days too, which is a
wow.
real scary thing. You know, the biggest importer of fentanyl is China, which is a scary thing unto itself. And you know, the people behind these stories, their families just like us. You know, the victims of terrible situations, whether it be just sports or, you know, maybe somebody has a tough go. They lose their job, they revert to alcoholism, or, you know, they deal with it in some way and eventually they get hooked. This person could have been an upstanding citizen. I think about all the lives that, you know, the 2008, 2009 economic crisis really harmed. And did people then transition over to dealing with it with other ways? You have to have compassion as much as possible when dealing with this stuff.
No, like you say, it's people in Ridgewood. It's people in the Heights. It's people in Luby Ave. I mean, there's no section that you can say, well, it's them, their people.
There's people on Whippoorwill Lane.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
on, you know, Yale Street and
it's
everywhere.
all of us.
Yeah.
And somehow something went wrong.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, Brian and I were able to secure that money. We were able to secure some money for the town of Mendon as well. And, you know, we'll continue to work together. I think, you know, this bill that Governor Baker filed with the ICE detention program, I think Brian and I can work together to provide a significant voice to explain what's happened in the town of Milford, how important this issue is, you know, how people have lost their lives with regard to public safety issues caused by people who have come here the wrong way.
Now, are you working with the other side because you have 6 colleagues that are...
Yeah, you got to. I wish I had 6. I have 5, you know.
5?
5 other Republicans, so 6 total. There is a special election. I'm sure you're going to have, I think you have some people scheduled down the road to come on your show and talk a little bit. But right next door to us, over in Mansfield and Foxborough area, there's a special election for Jim Timmelty's seat. He resigned to become the treasurer of Norfolk County. So I think the Republicans are actually going to pick that up. We'll get the lucky number 7.
One could be a statistically relevant change.
Yeah, exactly.
But still, I mean, it really bothered me. And in this regard, I don't think the Republicans are any better than the Democrats in Washington. But it just so happened the Republicans are in power now, so the Democrats said, anybody you send as a nominee to the Supreme Court, we will reject.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute. So if I'm Trump, instead of picking somebody quasi-centralist,
Right. You go right.
naff it, I'm going to the far right.
Yeah.
And someday, if the blue people take over the Senate, they'll go to the far left.
Yep.
And I sat there and thinking about it, saying, you could end up with a one-person Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because if I got 4 ultra uber right and 4 uber left, whoever picks the one in the middle
Yep.
controls the whole Supreme Court.
Yep. Or, and this could be a possibility just based on partisan gridlock, if the nominee couldn't be confirmed, and let's say a liberal justice was the one retiring, well, a swing vote that everyone talks about, Kennedy.
Well,
is
Kennedy to
potentially
me is the
being-
one I like because I never can figure out what he does.
Right. But let's say instead of Kennedy, it's Sotomayor. You know, say something terrible happens and she were to have a vacant seat, right? Because of the partisan gridlock that's happened in Washington, D.C., it's not unfathomable to say, okay, we'll have 8 justices instead
Then
of 9.
7, then 6.
You know, constitutionally, it's not spelled out.
There's
how
no
many-
number.
Exactly. In fact, this was a huge issue during FDR's presidency. You know, he said he was going to pack the court if you didn't, approve.
I'll dilute you out.
Exactly. And, that's a bad place to be. I can tell you, as a younger American who's in this business, if you will, it's just disgusting to me to watch what's going on. I'm a Republican. I'm proud of that. But Republicans have controlled Congress, and there's nothing that they've gotten done. If you are not willing to open up your fist and extend a hand, this country is worse off for it.
Ryan, both you and Brian, if you put party politics ahead of the kids of Milford,
Yeah,
you ain't gonna ever get my vote.
yeah,
You know, it comes down to you're walking across the aisle with your hand out to get things for our town and those other 12 others, but our town.
yep,
That's what I value.
right,
You know, young Joe Kennedy has impressed me more and more when I see him talking to Republicans, and that's not the biggest Republican family I know of.
No, I don't think so.
You know, but we may disagree with most of what he says, but when it comes down to getting stuff from Massachusetts,
Yeah,
he seems to compromise.
yeah,
So I'm not going to hold it against anybody what color they put down,
Right.
as long as they're doing the best they can for us.
Well, that's the concept, right? People need to do the best they can for the people, and it seems like that we've drifted.
Kind of forgotten
from,
that.
Yeah, we've drifted from that, and it's just really sad. You know, I will be honest. I love politics. I love following it. I kind of love the sport and game of it, and I have probably in the last 8 months been more disinterested in that than any other time I can remember in the last decade. And it's just because the tenor of the conversation, and I don't just blame, the elected officials and the political players. I think the news media has something to do with it. There's a legitimate question of who the heck do you trust? Everyone seems to be playing gotcha. And that's a huge problem too, because that's supposed to be a venerated institution that provides accountability.
And again, when you think about it, I mean, there's no secret, I was not an Obama supporter.
Yep.
Until the day he was elected president. Then he became my president, and I really hoped he would be successful.
Yeah.
Don't agree with everything, but you don't want him to fail.
Right.
This Trump shock syndrome, you feel like saying, guys, get over it,
Yeah.
because you want him to calm down.
Right. Yeah, you absolutely do. You want him to calm down and you want him to get off Twitter, right? But one of the things that really scares me about sort of the attitude and the conversation that's happening in DC is that there's real significant challenges across the world that are playing out, and we're distracted by petty politics a lot of times. You have Iran sending a satellite into orbit, which basically means they have the ability to launch a missile towards the United States.
Right.
You have North Korea developing
North
nuclear
Korea
weapons.
scares me the most of any country.
And while people think, maybe that Donald Trump isn't the most stable person, the leader of North Korea is insane. He doesn't care about his own
See,
people, and he
was-
doesn't care about
And
humanity.
Ryan, that's what scared me. When people worried about a nuclear exchange with Russia or the Soviet Union back when, never really bothered me. Because although their lives weren't great, they had a good life.
Right.
Americans, we had a good life.
Yep.
If we both knew pushing the button destroys your life and mine, yeah, you're not going to do it.
Right.
Mr. Dingaling in North Korea, that scares the living heck out of me, because he could be another one like Gaddafi and crew that
Yeah.
they could believe it's a good thing to die.
Kim Jong-un, ordered the assassination of his own brother. You know, I mean, what does that tell you? Russia, our relationship with Russia is at the worst point it's been since the Cold War. The same is probably true of China, right? Around the Nixon era. We've gone back to post, pre-Nixon.
The funniest thing is, I just got back from Shanghai a couple days ago, and people are, it's almost like Carter-esque, where they're laughing at us.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, some of the stuff I don't understand that Trump's doing. Then I read, well, the illegal immigration, because of his rhetoric, is down.
Right.
So he's built a verbal wall that's keeping people saying, I don't want to sneak into the U.S. Okay. Well, when are you going to face some of the real issues and stop talking about whether you were colluding with Russia or now the Hillary thing is back?
Right, yeah. Well, there's a personal response. It's kind of funny. Like, I part of the reason why I became a Republican in my life is just that concept of individual responsibility. And it was hammered home to me when I was young to something I always believed the Republican Party stood for. And I hope they still do. That's one of the reasons why I am a Republican. But I think everybody needs to take a long look in the mirror and say, what am I doing to make this situation better? And, instead of just abdicating responsibility.
Well, I mean, you look and you say, 11-day tenure in the Trump administration.
Mooch. Yeah.
Mooch. What could be worse?
Right.
Well, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-dingaling, killed his brother.
Right.
Okay, I guess being fired after 11 days is not the most pleasant experience.
Yeah.
But I'll take that over being shot.
Yeah.
Or being poisoned.
I know. And so my point overall was that there's tremendous issues around the world that are not being taken seriously, I think, by either the president or the Congress or the American public even, because of the distraction that's happened. And, people get more worked up about a tweet on Twitter than they do about the launching, if people even know that Iran launched a satellite into
what
orbit.
It means.
Yeah, I mean, if people have to realize, what a blessed world. I got my cell phone here, it's beeping satellite. The United States, France, England, China, developed countries who are pretty peaceful for the most part, are the only countries that have satellites in space in orbit. Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism, just launched a satellite. Now, my hope is, and we probably won't know this, that it won't be up there too long. That we will be able to do something to take it down, because I don't think them having that capability is a very good thing for the world. But, that's a huge development in society, and it's something that should concern everybody.
Yeah, I mean, again, as you look and you say, Trump has been his own worst enemy on a lot of things. Because if he would just stop stirring the pot, and we know the media loves.
Yeah.
I mean, I read the Times because I like their investigative reporting overseas, but oh my God, everything is Trump did this or Trump did that.
Yeah.
It's like, guys, get over it. Let's get on with making the country stronger.
Right.
Now, I hear, and maybe it had nothing to do with Trump, but Foxcom's putting in a multi-billion-dollar facility in the U.S. The maker of iPhones.
Yeah.
Right?
That's great news.
And you sit there and say, that ought to be, in my mind, front page.
Yep.
Because we said American manufacturing cannot compete with Chinese.
Right.
Well, I don't believe they're doing it to lose money.
Right, yeah, exactly. That's a great point. You mentioned iPhones too. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, so one of the things that I got appointed to since the last time I was on here, the Senate created a special committee that is about cyber technology and cyber security. And what we're designated to do is to come up with a list of recommendations about our own cybersecurity here in the state, how it might affect hospitals, how it might affect public infrastructure, and it's pretty interesting. I actually was in Milford on the day that I got appointed to it. I found out the day that there was an attack, a cyber terrorist attack on the infrastructure hospitals in the United Kingdom. If you remember, they shut down a lot of the infrastructure, electricity and water, And they basically created a situation where if you were dying, you could get medical attention. If you had a broken leg, if you had had a seizure, all these other things pushed to the side.
All on pause.
Exactly. And so it was a pretty significant moment. I was actually at the Blair House. We were having a legislative gathering. Brian Murray was there, Congressman Kennedy. And I just thought to myself, think about an infrastructure attack on the grid. You know, what would happen if people lost electricity? If you look down in North Carolina on the Outer Banks, they've lost electricity for 2 weeks. The economic impact is, I think I read something like $2 or $3 billion. I mean, that is incredible.
But you know, it's even the economic impact is one thing, but you've hit it. The grandfather living alone in a home, it's 100 degrees, they lose electricity.
Yep.
Their lives are at stake.
Yep. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have the capacity to understand these issues. We're trying to, get a primer and get, an inventory of all the things that we need to know about. There are 4 members of this committee. I am the Republican representative on it. And you've got Senator Lesser, who's a young guy, millennial like me. Senator Mike Moore, who is the chair of public safety. And there's one other, and
the blessing I think we have in Massachusetts is people like me have a hard time trying to figure out what's the difference between a conservative Democrat and a liberal Republican from Massachusetts. They seem pretty much in the middle and pretty similar.
Yeah, there's some blending.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
But they can work together.
Yeah. Well, I think people are looking for reasonableness. I've always said the R in front of my name stands for reform. I start to say now it's for reasonable. I like to think so. I'm sure there's some people out there who don't agree with that, but I think the reason why Charlie Baker has such a high approval rating is because he is kind of shot down the middle. On some issues, he's been center right. There have been some that have been a little bit center left. But people understand that he's trying to manage and do the best with what he has. He also understands that 80% of the legislature are Democrats, and if he is 80% Republican 100% of the time, he's never going to get anything done. And I don't think people in Massachusetts elected him to do nothing.
No, but when you look at the Weld era, it's the same thing.
Right.
You had, I dare say, a physical conservative who's socially aware.
Yep.
Of course, the minute he goes out to the square states, he gets barbecued.
Right, yeah.
But at least in our little world of Massachusetts, the R in front of your name being reasonable, our first half of the show, to me, is amazing that we have to discuss what seems like common sense, reasonable approaches.
Yeah, I agree.
But thank God we do.
Yeah, absolutely. But, and sometimes, to be honest, the governor drives me nuts in some of the things he says. But that's, part of being in politics.
Can't always agree with somebody on everything.
Yeah, and I can tell you, he says a lot less things that drove me nuts than Deval Patrick did.
Right.
And there's some things I agreed with Deval Patrick on, So it's about trying to find that consensus that I talked about earlier.
Thank you for being the reasonable representative. As always, get to know what's happening. Get to know the people who are representing us, because they're really, really doing an incredible job. And it's great that it doesn't matter if they're red or blue. They're talking, they're working together, and making Milford better. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And as always, to our 6 loyal viewers, may God bless. May tomorrow be a better night than tonight.
Can't believe it's been an hour already.
It's been an hour.
Not too long since I've been home.